And we are joined today by Michael Gingold. He is the man from Rue Morgue, Fangoria. He's got two new books out as well. Ad Nauseam 2, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1990s and 2000s, and also Ad Astra, 20 years of newsprint ads from Sci-Fi and Fantasy Films. Hey, Michael, how's it going today?
Okay, how are you?
I'm excellent. I'm glad to be speaking with you again. Thank you so much for taking the time out.
Oh, sure.
Well, you are back with not one, but two new books. First, I want to ask you about Ad Nauseam 2, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1990s and 2000s. I know we spoke to you last when the first book came out. This one seems like it picks up right where that one left off.
Yeah, well, I was collecting all the way through the 80s, 90s, and up until, I guess, the mid-2010s when newspaper advertising basically was phased out. And, people responded so strongly to the first one. I had so much more in the collection that I wanted to share that as well. The only issue was that in the 1990s with the video revolution, theatrical releases of horror films went way down. I think in 94 there were maybe 9 or 10 theatrically released horror films, at least in the New York area. So we figured there wasn't enough for just the book on the 90s, so we decided to combine it with the 2000s.
Yeah, and of course, most people our age think, late 70s into the 80s, probably the best time for horror films. As you mentioned, kind of sparse there in the 90s, but still some classics I know coming out here in the last 30 years.
Yeah, well, one thing, I actually kind of put a little piece on this together for Delirium magazine. There were a lot of really notable unrated horror films that came out. You had Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and Dead Alive. Man Bites Dog came out with an NC-17, and The Beyond finally got released uncut. So there weren't as many horror films that decade, certainly, and not a lot of really great ones, but there are certainly a number of interesting ones. Candyman came out of that decade, and going through the book, you see, it was sparse, but there was still quite a bit of good stuff that came out of that era.
So why do you think that is? Was it just maybe overkill, pun intended, I guess, in the 80s that people kind of cooled off in the 90s?
Well, the slasher genre was still kind of looked down on. I mean, there was a time whenever someone wanted to say horror film, they would say slasher film, because to some people that's all horror was in the 80s, even though there was a really good variety of movies out there. And the slasher franchises were kind of winding down. Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween and Friday the 13th, those movies weren't making the money they once were. And so horror still had kind of a bad name going into the 90s. And also, as I mentioned, video became big, and suddenly all these independent horror films that would have gotten theatrical release were going straight to video because the box office for independent horror films had gone down, and a lot of companies just wanted to get it out on video and make some fast money there. So, there were a lot of films in the 90s that should have got theatrical releases, but instead you had to go rent them on VHS instead.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that too, Michael. The ads and the artwork, that kind of started to seem to go downhill, or maybe become a little bit less inspired, I guess. The ads maybe formulaic a bit. Yeah, the shots of people, holding a weapon or just faces kind of took over for, more of the interesting stuff.
You had a lot less of these kind of maverick companies like Aquarius and these other ones that would really go for broke, and they knew they needed to attract attention in the newspaper advertising, so they would make their ads a lot bolder and crazier and make these outrageous claims in them, which turned out sometimes not to be true. It got a little bit more sedate, I guess, in the 90s, and you had, the Photoshop floating heads ads that Dimension Pictures kind of specialized in. So, you didn't have as much of the outrageous stuff, but at the same time, you did get some really memorable kind of subtler images. Like, I love the Candyman poster with the eye and the bee on it. And there's a number of others. And then as you get into the 2000s, things start to get a little bit more creative again. The one thing I miss is the taglines got a lot more sedate. You didn't have the really outrageous taglines you had in the 80s. You had a lot of these ones. There's the ones that I call the some should taglines, which is some doors shouldn't be opened and some gateways shouldn't be crossed. And that's kind of the inner world of horror advertising.
Well, again, Ad Nauseam 2, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1990s and 2000s is out. And I wanted to ask you about the, collecting the ads themselves. I imagine that must have gotten harder as, newsprint sort of started to dwindle a little bit. Not a lot of people still buy newspapers.
Yeah, well, more of the ads in this one than in the 80s one were out at the alt weeklies like the Village Voice. I guess newspaper advertising was cheaper there. I know ad rates went way up in the 90s too, so especially for the independents, you'd have a movie that would get a really small ad in the Times or the Daily News, but sometimes we get a full page ad in the Village Voice or something like that. So you could still find them pretty much towards the end of the 2000s when the internet had really taken over. And I guess by about 2014 or 15, it's when I just stopped collecting them because there wasn't that much to be had. The advertising had all migrated online. And, today if you pick up a newspaper, the movie section is maybe a page or two. And you have ads, the size of postage stamps, and that's about it. And it's a real lost art. It's one that, did continue into the 2000s, so I wanted to kind of celebrate that. And there's especially a great variety of stuff in the 2000s, and you can see a lot of ads for movies that might have gone to video in the 90s, but in the 2000s, they're actually kind of treated as art films and given special bookings. So it kind of came back in the 2000s, and it still continues. It's just there's no paper advertising to promote them anymore.
Yeah, that is weird to think, kids growing up or, even people in their 20s now, I guess, they don't have much concept of, cutting out ads for the theater or circling, stuff in the TV Guide or the Sears catalogs. Stuff changed pretty quickly here, it seems.
Yeah, well, I hear from so many people. When I started doing this as a kid, I thought I was the only one. And I've heard from so many people who told me that they did the same thing and they kept scrapbooks of them. And, some of them still have their collections, and it was a much bigger hobby than I thought, and it's really great that the book is kind of, the people have responded to it that way on a personal level, because this is something that they did as well.
I love that you mentioned in the book there was a handful of movie critics out there who kind of supplied most of the favorable quotes for reviews for some of these films that weren't very good. Sometimes maybe they didn't even say the stuff, they were just allowing it to be attributed to them.
Oh, the quote wars, yeah. I mean, I have a little bit of that at Fangoria myself. I was quoted in a few of these ads, and there were occasions when, they wanted to put my name on a quote that they supplied me, and I said no. It had to be something that was out of the review. And one time, a movie, it was a direct-to-video film, but they tried to pull a fast one, and they took a line out of my review and then added their own line and attributed it all to me. And I saw an advanced copy of the box cover, and I said, no, you can't do that. You have to take that part out. I only want my name attributed to something I actually wrote. But there were a number of critics who were very happy to, put their name on whatever just so they could see their name in an ad and get it to junkets and everything. So that really was something that rose in the 90s and became more applied to horror than it had been before.
Yeah, I don't know what that does to your credibility, I guess, if they attributed something to you and then the film turns out to be awful. I don't know if you get much blowback from that, or do you have people calling the office wanting your head maybe? Or
I mean, not for quotes that I had. It's actually interesting. The greatest blowback I ever got was not for a horror film. I reviewed Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, on the Fango website, and in there I said how much better it was as a second in a trilogy than Star Wars Attack of the Clones. And the Star Wars fans lost their freaking minds, and I did get some angry emails about that, saying that, that I didn't know anything about filmmaking and that I should hang it up, and, what is your bias against Star Wars and everything? And, I think we see that continue to this day with all the negative reactions to some of the recent films that have come out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, let's talk about the other book here. Speaking of Star Wars, you've got Ad Astra, the 20 years of newsprint ads for sci-fi and fantasy films. I got to say, first of all, it's pretty ambitious to be releasing two books like this, pretty much right at the same time.
We knew we wanted to do two of them, and we decided that, we didn't want to drag it out and, have, having one come out and then waiting another year for the other one. We really wanted to kind of strike while the iron is hot, and I think they kind of appeal to different readerships. I think the horror crowd is a little bit different from the nostalgia crowd that would be interested in something that covers Star Wars and Star Trek and the Indiana Jones films and that kind of thing. I think it's a slightly different kind of fandom and a different kind of nostalgia. So I'm hoping that people respond to Ad Astra the way they did to Ad Nauseam.
Yeah, definitely. All three books are amazing. And, it's incredible to go back and see the release dates for these films. It seems like so many times two or maybe three of your all-time favorite films were being released, in the same month, same week, maybe. Nowadays, I get excited to go to the theater maybe like once every 2 years.
There's certain summers like 1982 and 84 where there was just one great movie coming out after another. Gremlins and Ghostbusters came out the same day, so that was a big one. In 82, you had great stuff coming out. I think Star Trek 2 and Poltergeist came out the same weekend or within a week or so of each other, so it was a real boom time for that kind of thing. It was in kind of the post-Star Wars era when sci-fi and fantasy became really big, and you had all these great films. Blade Runner and The Thing came out the same day, though those weren't quite as popular back at the time. So those are really kind of golden years, and so there's, just going back to Ad Astra especially, that really resonated just with me, remembering going to see Raiders of the Lost Ark and things like that for the first time. It was a really exciting time to be a kid who was into that kind of thing.
Definitely. Well, with that being said, I got to ask you to set the record straight here a little bit. Why is there so much hate?
Sure.
Why is there so much hate for Howard the Duck? I love that movie, but everybody seems to think it's horrible.
Well, I do love the stop-motion creature at the end. I do recall also thinking it was pretty terrible when I saw it back at the time. I haven't gone back and reanalyzed it, but, I kind of walked into that, having heard how terrible it was and having read the reviews and was thinking, well, it can't be that bad. And when I went to see it with a couple of my friends, we were all like, yeah, this is that bad. Maybe I would appreciate it more having seen it, if I saw it again, but I just haven't had a chance to go back. But I do like that creature at the end. The creature is pretty great.
Yeah, that's one thing definitely that's different now is you can go on the internet probably within hours of the film being released and you know exactly what happens and everyone's got the reviews up and you probably can even watch it on YouTube somewhere. So you don't go in there kind of with a clean slate and not knowing what to expect.
That was one of the great things about going to movies in general back then is going into something, especially with some of the horror films in the 80s and 90s when foreign films would get retitled and things would come out that you just didn't know what the hell you were seeing. Going back to the 80s, Pieces was a great example. I saw this ad and I was like, what is this film? It hadn't been covered in Fangoria. I read Variety at the time and it wasn't, I'd never seen it listed in there. And I just saw this absolutely insane film and I had no clue where it had come from. So, there's definitely something that's been lost these days because every film now gets, it tends to hit a few festivals first, so there's buzz out of there before the general public gets to see it. And you don't get that real sense of discovery. Even working in the field the way I do, by the time I see a film, I usually read something about it somewhere. It's rare that I kind of walk into something completely cold. But I do love it when I do. There have been occasions where I've seen something at its festival premiere and just been knocked out by it, knowing nothing about it when I sat down.
Well, again, Ad Nauseam 2 is out and Ad Astra is out. Could we see maybe a fourth book in this series, like a volume on 80s sex comedies or, something like that?
Oh, I would love to see that. Unfortunately, my personal collection is pretty much exhausted by this point, but I've been saying all along I would love it if someone came up with a collection of ads for 70s and 80s comedies because those ads were always really outrageous and funny, or 70s and 80s action films. It would be great if we could kind of get a whole encyclopedia going of all that stuff. So, if anyone out there, has a collection like that, they should make themselves known because I would personally love to see a whole bunch more books of this type come out.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I know the 2 books are just out here, but I know you're doing a lot of other work for, Rue Morgue and a lot of other places. What's coming up for you? Is there anything else we should be looking out for?
Well, I just finished a feature-length documentary for a Blu-ray release I cannot mention the name of, but that'll be coming out hopefully by the end of the year. And I'm busy working on featurettes of that kind, and got another book that I'm working on. I can't really say anything else about it, but I'm hoping there can be an announcement about that by early next year. And that's just my regular writing for Fangoria, Rue Morgue, and I write for Birth Movie Stuff online, so I'm working in a whole bunch of different places at the moment.
Awesome. Well, if the new book you're working on is anything like your past books, or even in that same vein, I would definitely love to speak with you again here coming up next year.
Oh, sure, yeah. I'll definitely be announcing it if and when it happens. It hasn't been completely worked out yet. There's actually a couple of things I'm working on that I'm hoping to see out by the end of next year, so hopefully we'll be able to talk about them in a year's time.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to that. And again, Michael, thank you so much for joining me again. I always love this kind of thing, and I'm glad to help out whenever I can. So thank you again for your time.
Well, thanks so much for your interest and for having me on the show.
And again, that was Michael Gingold from Fangoria, from Rue Morgue. His new books, Ad Nauseam 2, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1990s and 2000s is out. Also, Ad Astra, 20 years of newspaper ads for sci-fi and fantasy films. That book is out as well.